In this lesson, what we're going to do is move on and talk about both the methods of and the effectiveness of Parliament in its ability to scrutinise the executive, to scrutinise the government. So, as I've just mentioned, we're going to examine all the ways in which Parliament does scrutinise the government and holds them to account, specifically the executive branch, which is what we mean by the government, and we shall look at the methods to begin with about about how Parliament manages to scrutinise the government, the methods by which they utilise to do so, and then we will look at how effective those methods actually are by examining the advantages and disadvantages of each of these particular methods for government scrutinisation. So beginning with the different types of methods, there are a few main methods that Parliament uses and practices on a day-to-day basis that leads to government scrutiny. So for example, MPs and peers, mainly MPs in this example, have the ability to ask questions to government ministers, the most popular of these being Prime Minister's questions. This happens every single Wednesday. Now, a second method of government scrutiny is that takes place within the context of departmental select committees. Now, this is a method by which each select committee is chaired by a number of different people from different parties, and they can really analyse and be able to get to the depths of the different issues relating to different policies and proposed legislation that the government is trying to enact. A third method is that when the government pushes policy and makes legislation, each bill has to go through the different stages of Parliament. There are a number of different reading stages of Parliament. There are a number of different stages that have and allow for the opportunity for members of Parliament to debate the merits, the advantages and disadvantages of each of these particular bills. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if a piece of legislation wants to receive royal assent from the monarch, they have to go through both houses of Parliament and both of these different stages. So this is another way in which Parliament has the ability to scrutinise government legislation. And then finally, the strongest option is the vote of no confidence in the government. It's strong in the ways that it is, if it is successful, it would ultimately bring down a government and is arguably the ultimate holding to account. But it is also at the same time not as strong in the sense that it is not as popular, and it is increasingly becoming more and more rare that it is even mentioned as an option for a particular government action, and B, if it is mentioned and is put into practice, is very rare that it is actually successful, a vote of no confidence. So these are the different methods that we can think about when we're talking about the ways in which Parliament scrutinises the executive. Now the question is, how effective are each of these methods in doing so? And let's begin with parliamentary questions, and specifically focusing on Prime Minister's questions, because the Prime Minister is the head of the executive, and because Prime Minister's questions is the most significant in terms of public image and in terms of the popularity of it. Now, parliamentary questions provide a very good opportunity to question the government and also to attack them for particular decisions. This can cause numerous controversies, with difficult and often unwelcome questions being asked to various ministers of state. And if a minister of state has done something that is particularly controversial or able to be criticised, then you will see the majority of this criticism taking place during these ministerial questions. So, a very good example that you can talk about, some of the most recent examples of very difficult and unwelcome questions being asked to various ministers of state take place around the end of the 2021 and early 2022 at Prime Minister's questions, where the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was questioned quite vigorously for multiple weeks over various Downing Street parties that took place in violation of the law during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, this was a period of a good couple of months where these questions were constantly being asked to the Prime Minister, and these are clearly periods of time that the Prime Minister himself was definitely uncomfortable with these kinds of questions being asked. Examples as well from history. We have Tony Blair stating that Prime Minister's questions was the, quote, most nerve-wracking, discombobulating, nail-biting, bowel-moving, terror-inspiring, courage-draining experience in their life as Prime Minister. So you can understand that, and you can see from reports from other Prime Ministers in history, David Cameron being another notable example of speaking up about this, the method of Prime Minister's questions, that this is a very, very, very uncomfortable scenario to be in, and you can see that the Prime Ministers in history tend to dislike Prime Minister's questions the most. However, in some regards, parliamentary questions, and specifically Prime Minister's questions, isn't always as effective as we can describe it to be. For example, Prime Minister's questions, because it is a very open and very public platform, you'll see that the chamber is often entirely full during Prime Minister's questions. It is often live streamed across multiple different news and media outlets. It seems to be the case that the questions are asked not really to actually scrutinise government action in any particular way, but more to present a personal political message. So to the point where a lot of MPs, when they're asking questions in PMQs, aren't really asking questions to the Prime Minister. They're delivering a speech on their own political values, because they know that this is going to be a very popular time and that they're going to get a lot of coverage when they ask questions. So it's a good way for them to present their own personal political message rather than actually scrutinising some particular details of policy. The next method is the method of parliamentary debates. Now, this incorporates both general debates that take place that are scheduled within the House of Parliament, and also debates that take place in relation to the passage of a particular piece of legislation. Parliamentary debates are significant because they allow members of Parliament to voice their opinions on particular issues of policy, as well as potential acts of Parliament that are to be passed into law. They're an opportunity not only to voice their opinions to other members of Parliament, namely to have debates within the chamber themselves, but to also voice their opinions to the wider public, because they're often televised and can be widely viewed, depending on the issue at hand. If it is a particular foreign policy issue, like maybe an armed conflict going on in the world and something like that, then it is often the case that it gets quite a lot of broad eyes on the issue, and a lot of people tune into the debate. However, again, just like with the method of Prime Minister's questions, it is not always as effective as you might first think. A lot of MPs do speeches, and may do speeches in Parliament during parliamentary debates, again for the purposes of facilitating broader popular support for them, because they know there's a lot of eyes on the particular issue and they're being televised, rather than actually debating the policy. You will often see that, just like with Prime Minister's questions, debates with MPs in Parliament are often not always the comments that are made aren't often always directed at each other, and people don't often respond to each other directly. They're often responding sort of indirectly while talking to the audience that is watching. Even though MPs have the opportunity to voice their opinions as well, when it comes to things like votes on pieces of legislation, they often vote along party lines. So it's not particularly that effective if they voice their opinions but then vote with or without, with the government or with the opposition, then this isn't particularly helpful. A more interesting example of scrutiny of the executive is the system of select committees, the select committee system. And it is often a lot more private and a lot more useful in that regard, since it actually seeks to engage in the policies in question in more detail. It's less about trying to present a political message to the wider public and more about trying to scrutinise the policies that the government are trying to push through. They're often chaired by members of Parliament of different political parties, and this is obviously useful in it providing a certain utility, since it allows for a selection of opinions and different political ideologies to be voiced at the same time within the same meeting. They have also got the power to call witnesses on both sides of the political spectrum to give evidence on a number of issues. This is very, very helpful because it allows for outside and broader knowledge about a particular problem to be voiced within the legislative process and the process of passing laws, which is obviously something that is quite helpful. And when reports by select committees are published or sent to the government has just 60 days to respond. And this is a requirement. The government is required to respond to the select committee's reports within 60 days. And this presents a significant and powerful check on the power of the government, because if a select committee publishes a report that is particularly damning of the government has to respond to that report, and that report could provide some public scrutiny more broadly to the executive, not just within Parliament. But again, just like the other systems that we've talked about, there are issues with the committee system as well. So, for example, within a select committee system, the governing party will always have a majority in each select committee. The select committee system is selected based on the amount of seats that each political party within Parliament has. And if there is a governing party, they are the ones that have the most seats in Parliament. Therefore, we have a system where even though the select committee is designed to try and attack and to scrutinise government decisions, the governing party hold the majority of the seats within it. This gives the government a certain amount of political power in these institutions. And while it is a good thing that the government has to respond within 60 days of a public publishing of a select committee report, they don't actually have to implement any of the recommendations made by the select committees in question. All they have to do is respond to it. So they could really just provide a very weak response to a particular issue and not do anything about the things that the select committee report actually raised. And it again gives if the government chooses not to implement any policy, this can provide a significant disadvantage to the select committee system, because at that point their hands are tied. The final thing I want to talk about is the vote of no confidence. Now, the vote of no confidence, again, is both a very strong option, but is also conversely a very weak option at the same time. It's quite a bit of a dichotomy in this regard, because on the one hand, the no confidence vote is ultimately the final option. It's ultimately the nuclear option for Parliament to enact, because it will effectively bring down the government if successful, and that's obviously the most ultimate check that you can provide and you can have on the government. But on the other hand, it is severely limited, since it is A, unlikely to succeed, and B, hardly ever used. So this is obviously a problem when, if at the end of the day this nuclear option is so rarely used, and if it is ever used is so really successful, well, then this provides a very weak option for the vote of no confidence. And an example of the last time it was actually successful was in 1979 with James Callaghan's Labour government, and it was only successful by one vote. So it was very, very, very close to being unsuccessful at the same time. And this was in 1979. This was over 40 years ago. So we can see that the vote of no confidence is not particularly very helpful, but it is, and it does represent a very, very strong, often called the quote nuclear option for government scrutiny, for scrutiny of the government by Parliament.